Hello everybody and welcome back to lecture. Today is the 14th for me, but will actually be a lecture for the week before that for you guys. Obviously I'm a little bit behind, but doing these lectures this way has been better for me and I think probably better for you guys to have them piecemeal. But without further ado, let's just continue where we are. So when we left off with lecture on, let's see, well, whatever fake day that was, we had finished talking about Lend, Lease, and rearmament in the United States. And it's kind of, now we're getting to the point where as the United States is preparing for World War II and really preparing for its intervention, this is kind of the 1940, 1941, really, the full year of 1941 before December 7th, obviously, in which we prepare for entry into the war. Americans didn't really know how or why they were going to get involved in the war. Well, they knew the why. They didn't necessarily know the how for getting involved in the war. And as we'll talk about in a minute, one of the belligerent nations essentially drags them into the war. But we should understand that the United States doesn't get involved all of a sudden one day because it's because it's attacked. It gets involved because it was A, gearing up to be involved, and B, had demonstrable things that had upset the American public and had gotten them interested in getting involved as well. There are two big things we want to talk to in terms of American preparedness before the war. One is, and it's kind of interesting mostly as a historical fact, but also in terms of how we conceptualize the era now, is the re-election of President Roosevelt for his third term. Obviously, he is the only American president to win a third term. He'll also be the only American president to win a fourth term. Really, the only during his election campaign, even his opponent wasn't terribly opposed to any of the policies he was enacting, because the first two terms he'd won, the first 8 years, had been this large scale. We've talked about the work progress, the recovery after the Great Depression. He'd been very successful at that. Roosevelt was very much the man in the United States, and a third term was seen not as something he deserved so much, but most Americans wanted the continuity of leadership, and they kind of threw out the worry that any president should have more than 2 terms. At this point, it wasn't constitutional or unconstitutional to serve more than 2 terms. It was largely just a precedent set by Washington himself. However, Roosevelt runs for a third term largely on the very correct assumption that the United States, as it prepares to enter World War II, which at the time was already showing signs it would be the largest war in human history, and was eventually the largest war in human history, Americans wanted to know that there was a continuity of leadership as it prepared to enter this war. And so Roosevelt wins this election handily. Even his challenger, as I said, was mostly on board with all of his New Deal ideas, all of his recovery efforts. He just simply believed that Roosevelt shouldn't run for a third term, which, depending on how you feel individually as an American, is a good critique or not a good critique. At the time, it probably was important that Roosevelt ran for that third term, and he won handily. This image here of Hitler in Paris in 1940 after the fall of France was an enduring image that a lot of Americans saw of the Battle of France and the collapse of the French. This is important to think about because the last war that the Americans paid attention to in Europe, and the last war that I told you to pay attention in Europe, World War I, was largely won on the backs of the French. They suffered terribly for 4 years, as we talked about, but emerged victorious. The Blitzkrieg attack that destroyed France, the one that we talked about, went behind their fortress lines, knocked them out in just a few weeks. So Americans weren't just shocked by the size of the impending war. They certainly weren't shocked by the methods it was being waged, but they were shocked at the speed at which France collapsed, and it put many Americans into kind of an overdrive, believing that the United States needed to catch up to the powers that were at war, so to speak. It's a good thing the United States did this. In 1940, the United States, before U.S. was officially at war, reinstituted the draft. This was the first peacetime draft in American history, which is kind of important because it sheds light on a couple different things we've long thought about American attitudes towards the military. This draft, which starts in 1940, is not permanently shut off until it lapsed in the mid-1970s after Vietnam. What's important about that is for nearly 25 years, excuse me, my edition's not not that bad today. For nearly 35 years, the U.S. drafted its entire male population and either assigned them time in the military or assigned them time in the reserves. That's one of the very few sets of American military history in which the U.S. government has reached into its populace and tapped its essentially material resources of humans, so to speak. In fact, the U.S. Army during World War II grows to 16 million men at one point, with another about million and a half women working in the military as well. It's certainly the high point of military personnel for the United States, but it was necessary to win what will eventually become a gigantic two-front world war. More interestingly, though, it was enacted at peacetime. The United States was not at war in 1940, but the vast majority of Americans were okay with the draft being instituted in peacetime when the rest of the world was so clearly at war, and a war that the United States would join. It's a good thing the United States was preparing, because at the same time, we have to return to the reason why they get involved. Now, I'm sure many of you all know a bit about, or at least have heard about, Pearl Harbor and December 7th, 1941. Now, it's important for us to understand in the course of the war Japan's strategic goals in World War II. There are lots of really interesting books on why the Japanese attacked us at the Battle of Pearl Harbor. It's better to understand them more holistically. Far too often Americans, when they think about this, think about it as kind of an isolated incident. But as you guys remember, and as you guys were told earlier in the semester, the Japanese and American empires in the Pacific had been running into each other for a while, for essentially the better part of 50 years. And a conflict, depending on what its size was or the reasons as to why it happened, seemed almost inevitable between both the Japanese High Command and the American Strategic Command. What's interesting about that is the Japanese will be the people who eventually take the initiative in launching that war, but many American military historians now talk quite a bit about the ways in which the Americans forced the Japanese kind of into a life or death struggle with the United States, which the United States knew absolutely it could win. As Japan began expanding into those former colonial possessions across the southeast that we already talked about, into the British, into the French, eventually we'll talk about the Philippines as well. The Japanese, while they avoided attacking American possessions, were very, very keen on seizing resource-rich territories, as we talked about. However, even in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, the U.S. and the Japanese traded significant amount of what we would consider war materials today. The Americans sold Japanese oil. They sold in machine parts for their planes and tanks. The Americans were willing to sell the Japanese these goods right up until just before the war. Eventually, though, because of Japan's consistent invasion and taking of Allied territories, or at least friendly territories like the British and the French, the Americans eventually begin to implement what we call today, and I'm sure you guys have all heard this, economic sanctions on the Japanese. It's not a particularly new term. In fact, it's a very old term in politics and military spheres. Eventually, the American government refuses to continue to trade with the Japanese if they continue to act aggressively on the world stage, which they obviously are going to continue to do, because in their search for greater prosperity and greater imperial territory, they don't really care what the Americans are saying. But as the two powers get closer and closer to combat, the Americans realize it's probably not a great idea to continue to sell our allies things that they need for the war effort. Once the Americans had shut off oil supplies and munition supplies to the Japanese understood they were already behind the eight ball with the Americans, so to speak. And I don't mean in terms of anything other than pure logistical might. The United States, as everyone knew at the time, despite what people might say in hindsight, the American country was a giant waiting to be awakened, industrially, financially, economically, certainly in terms of agriculture production, munitions production, tank production. America, as it was called at the time, was very much the arsenal of democracy, because it could simply swallow up every other major power in terms of its war production, with the exception of the Soviets, but that was for a different reason. By 1940, 1941, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, the United States is exporting a huge amount of war material to the British and to the Russians under the guise of that Lend-Lease policy we talked about. Really, without American manufacturing, there's no way the British or the Russians would have lasted as long as they did in the war. Obviously, the trade-off there is the Brits and the Russians paid for that with their lives, but the munitions got to them basically through U.S. intervention. The U.S. saved those countries economically in the way they saved the war militarily. So, let's continue. By 1941, the Japanese High Command had made the decision to attack the United States. It understood, because it was so far behind economically, because it was so far behind in terms of a long-term war, and this isn't us assuming this, the Japanese High Command talked about it regularly, the Japanese believed that because they knew they could not win a long-term war with the United States, they had to do as much damage as possible during the first attack. It had to be an attack that was so devastating that it would set back the American preparations to fight a naval war across the Pacific for several years. Essentially, what the Japanese were banking on is, by destroying the Pearl Harbor naval base the United States had, and by destroying America's ability to fight a naval war in the Pacific for at least 2 or 3 years, the Japanese were gambling. They assumed that American manufacturing could not produce battleships and aircraft carriers. We'll talk a little bit about aircraft carriers becoming increasingly important in the Pacific. They just assumed that American manufacturing couldn't keep up. And they essentially also thought if they could really destroy this fleet before the Americans even knew they were at war, they would have 2 or 3 years of lead time to finish their campaigns in East Asia and then prepare for an American invasion. It was a gamble. The Japanese High Command absolutely knew it that way. The architect of it, the great Admiral Yamato, who studied extensively in the United States, had seen American manufacturing with his own 2 eyes, spoke English, really a brilliant naval mastermind, one of the great naval tacticians in world history. Yamato knew what he was up against. Having studied in the U.S., he was well aware of their industrial power and was frankly quite afraid of it. He told the rest of the Japanese High Command that this was the only way to do it, but even if they did it, it was unlikely to work long term. He was absolutely right. On that morning, December 7th, the date that Franklin Delano Roosevelt would eventually say, a date that will live in infamy, the Japanese attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii, Oahu. And that morning, the American military, A, didn't know it was coming, and B, got extremely lucky. There have been some interesting documents revealed about just how much the American government knew about the impending Pearl Harbor attack, and given the fact that the United States had already cracked Japanese codes by 1940, which was very, very quick, and this is one of those things we'll talk about later as technology for the war, as the American technology bubble swamps the rest of the competition. The Americans already cracked Japanese code by 1940 and had some idea a surprise attack was coming. After all, if you guys remember all the way back to the last time we talked about an important war for the Japanese against the Russians in Korea, you guys remember the naval battle of, we talked about Tsushima, and before that, the attack on the Russian naval harbor at Port Arthur. The Japanese used a surprise attack during that war as well. They did not tell the Russians until they were literally attacking that morning. 40 years later, they attempt the exact same tactic on the Americans. Now, we shouldn't impart any real military thought about this, except for the fact the Japanese kind of had to do it this way. They were smaller, less industrialized, had far less resources. For them, this is a correct strategic thinking. If you're the little guy, you got to punch first and you got to punch harder. They knew they couldn't win a long war. This is why they punched first at Pearl Harbor. I want you guys to watch. I put it on the next slide. I want you guys. I'm going to upload this at some point. This is a clip from the movie Pearl Harbor. Just the attack scene itself, so you kind of get a feeling of the attack that day. More than 2,100 American sailors and soldiers were killed on the island, and all of the major American battleships were destroyed at anchor. As you can see here. From the last screen, this is the USS Arizona, which was crippled in the harbor and sank with the loss of more than 1,000 crew, one of the worst naval disasters in American history. Very few Japanese planes were shot down. All in all, for the Japanese, it was a critical success. They destroyed all of the main battleships, several main cruisers for the Americans, but two very, very crucial things were missed by the Japanese. Two things that would, in the end, kind of pave the way for the collapse of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. One, the bombers, who did extensive damage to the battleships of the American fleet, did almost no damage to the naval station of Oahu itself. And while that seems like a small thing, if you guys remember, these naval stations are expensive. That's why the American government spent so much time during the Imperial Age building up these naval and coaling stations across the Pacific. It's not coal by the 1940s, but all of the oil refineries in Hawaii, all of the munitions production facilities in Hawaii, all of the main military production areas on Hawaii completely and utterly survived unscathed. So one, the Americans didn't have to rebuild their base on Pearl Harbor. Of course, there was massive problems in cleanup, cats, but at least the major refineries were safe. Secondly, and far more importantly, the one thing that escaped destruction that day was the American carrier fleet. The American carriers that had been based on Oahu were just out of port that morning on patrol, and because of that, they survived the onslaught of the Japanese air attack, which destroyed the battleships, as we talked about. Why this is important is, even though battleships were really in vogue, as you guys remember, we talked about battleships and Teddy Roosevelt and America's desire to have more of them and how important they were, by the 1940s, most naval tacticians believed that the future of naval combat was via carriers, in which carriers would fight battles against each other across vast distances of the ocean by sending up their planes to go look for the enemy carriers. And by and large, those naval tacticians were quite correct. Yes, of course it was important to have battleships, and of course it was important to have cruisers and destroyers and all the other parts of a navy, but by now, carriers were dominant and continue to be so today, with the exception of maybe nuclear submarines. But anyways, by this point, the United States was officially at war. The next day, FDR took gave his famous speech to Congress, asked for a declaration of war, and was given it. This was just a declaration of war with Japan, but within a few days, the Italians and the Germans, as you guys are all aware of those enemies, will go ahead and declare war on the United States, who will follow suit. This is kind of one of those interesting quirks of history, because Hitler was not actually required to declare war on the United States as part of his his alliance in the Axis alliance. He went ahead and did that largely on his own volition, against the advice of many of his generals, who pointed out quite correctly, why in the hell would you pull the American tiger's tail before it has any reason to get involved directly with you? Because of that, the Americans would go ahead and link up with the British and Soviet high commands and essentially decide on how they would fight this war. Now, by 1941, the war was very much up in the air as to which side would win it. By 1942, 1943, it becomes more apparent, and we'll talk about that as to why in a bit. But what's important about this is, once the Americans, the British, and the Soviets, the three big alliances, there's others obviously, especially the Free French who escaped the Germans, some French who escaped the Germans, generally these three put together a military strategy in which they understand that the Americans and the British particularly, those two are fighting a two-front war against the Japanese and the Germans/Italians. And because of that, they need to fight both wars, but they need to concentrate more heavily on one than the other. You can't simply allocate resources completely to one or the other without both falling apart. But essentially, the United States got the luxury of not having to deploy against either enemy immediately, because with the exception of Hawaii itself, the American mainland wasn't threatened in any significant way. There were some Japanese movements towards Alaska, but again, not the contiguous United States. What's interesting about that is the Allies, so the Soviets, the Americans, and the British, decide to concentrate first on Germany and Hitler, deciding that he is the more dangerous foe, and frankly, the foe that needs to be dealt with sooner, largely because of his proximity to Britain, largely because he was already invading Russia, as we had talked about. Now, that's important in the long run for a couple reasons. One, it means the Americans will end up allocating more resources to the European war effort, something in the neighborhood of 60 to 40 or 70 to 30, depending on which specific statistics you're looking at. It also means the Japanese campaign will have to wait for later. Even though it's being fought, it's largely a holding action initially to make sure the Americans can concentrate on destroy the Germans. Now, for the Americans to destroy the Germans, there has to be a Britain still kicking. And so during 1941, 1942, 1943, and really till the end of the war, there's two separate battles being waged. One is the battle for Britain itself, and that's an aerial battle that we talked about a little bit briefly. The Germans each night would bomb all over the country, but particularly London. The Royal Air Force would rise up and meet them, and these battles would take place in the air, in the skies, with many thousands of English citizens looking up and watching them as they fought. These were a brutal, brutal bloodbath between German pilots and bombers and British pilots. Now, we must give the citizens, average citizens of London, panic. This is really the age of keep calm and carry on. A generation of British people who grew up under what they called the Blitz, the bombing of London by German aircraft. Eventually, Hitler will kind of get peeled away and will lose the Battle of Britain because he redeploys large amounts of his air force, obviously, to the Eastern Front against Russia. And without the concentrated of resources of Germany all focused on Britain at once, it means that eventually they will take advantage of the air war and begin that. The second one should look familiar to you. The second part of the war should look familiar because it's exactly what the Germans did during World War I that eventually brought the United States in against them. This is that U-boat warfare, submarine warfare, targeting largely merchant shipping and the valuable resources that the United States and other countries were sending to Great Britain and the Soviets. The Germans were much more effective during this war than they were in World War I in terms of actually blockading the British. They had a much larger, much more dangerous, and much more strategically minded U-boat command during this war. It also helps that technology had changed significantly in 40 years. But for several months, it looks like the Germans might succeed in starving the British to death, as they sink quite literally hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping on the approaches to Britain. It won't be really until the invention of radar, of undersea radar especially, sonar is what we'll be talking about there, and it certainly wouldn't be until the birth of the convoy system that eventually the German stranglehold is broken. But in both battles, on air and under the water, the British are victorious, and the Germans, for a host of reasons, have to reconcentrate forces elsewhere that they badly needed to fight against, to essentially fight against the Russians because of Hitler's tactical failures in deciding to invade Russia. So, as the tide begins to, I won't say turn, but begins to look better for the Allies, things get far, far more disgusting on the Eastern Front. This is the battle, so this here is the second attack. You can see from the different colors, and I'd recommend you guys look at this. This is the invasion of Russia that we talked about earlier. The one that was just cruising across eastern Poland, Russia. And as you can see, this is a massive war, a massive front in which the Germans and their allies are fighting all across Russia. What's important, and the reason the Russians are able to essentially fight off the Germans despite appalling casualties, despite appalling starvation, privation, the Russian people will lose in the tens of millions from starvation alone during this war. They're able to do so because almost as soon as the Germans invaded, Stalin made one smart move, and the man didn't have a lot in him. In fact, he may have been one of the most dumb, brutal authoritarians ever, which is saying something. Stalin was smart enough to understand the Soviet Union could only last as long as its ability to keep up in the arms race of the war. So early in the war, nearly 3,000 entire factories were picked up part by part from where they were on the eastern side of the Ural Mountains and moved to from the western side of the Ural Mountains to the eastern side. Essentially, think about the building you work in today. Think about picking up the entirety of it, most of the walls, most of the machinery included, and shipping them several hundred miles to the west, and then continuing your day job as if nothing happened. That's exactly what the Soviet Union did. 3,000 factories, hundreds of thousands of workers, eventually millions of workers and laborers, relocated to the comparatively safe area behind the Ural Mountains. Had it not been for the evacuation of these factories, there's no way the Russians could have kept up with the German attack. As it was, they weren't keeping up with the German attack and had to be bailed out significantly by American shipping, which came via the Pacific all the way around the northern front and then landed at Archangel in the very, very Arctic Circle to bring supplies to the Soviets. A very dangerous route, but an important one. So as the war continued, it passed from summer towards winter. And the Germans had never planned for their Soviet campaign to last into the winter. Not only does it last into the winter of 41, it ends up lasting until the end of the war. A disastrous decision that will cost the lives of millions of Europeans, not only in the zone, the soldiers themselves, the civilians. We'll talk about the Holocaust of these people later, but simply the dislocation caused by this war causes millions to die of starvation, to die of privation. Frequently, German soldiers would go into Russian villages and strip them of anything of value and then simply leave the Russian peasants to die. It happened in the tens of thousands weekly, largely because of how the Germans felt about the Russians. You see it again and again in German individual soldiers writing their feeling of the Russian peasants as lesser people. The Aryan Nazism that Hitler instilled in the military is very apparent in their beliefs about the Eastern Front. But part of it too is the Eastern Front, and as you might expect from rural Russia in the 1920s and 30s, it's a very poor and backwards area. And these Germans, many coming from large industrial cities and preconditioned by Hitler and by German beliefs about lesser people, saw them as essentially primitives and killed them in just barbaric numbers. We'll talk a little bit more of the death squads later, especially the Einsatzgruppen who followed the troops. But the Holocaust wasn't always about death camps. It often was about individual privation and murder right in the moment. Not everybody got on a train, which I guess is some mercy in some way. To continue. By 1942, almost all of the war had slowed to an important battle, if I can find my city, at Stalingrad on the southern Volga. A city that will become, both in Russian minds and in German minds, this focal point of the war, in which the Eastern Front devolves into a contest of wills between the Germans and between the Soviets, particularly between Hitler and Stalin. Both men hated each other. In fact, Stalingrad, as you can obviously tell, had been renamed for Stalin himself. The loss of this gigantic city, the loss of this vastly important city, would have meant essentially not just a prestige blow to the Soviets, but probably a death blow if the German tanks were able to advance east from Stalingrad. It probably would have been the capture of Moscow. And in fact, the Germans come very close. They come within sight of the golden domes of the Russian Kremlin at one point, but are called off elsewhere for projects like Stalingrad and don't take the city. Unlike Napoleon, who in 1914 does take Moscow, or 1912, excuse me, 1812 does take Moscow. So, Stalingrad becomes this contest of wills that goes on for months and months and months. The city starves. The city is bombarded. The city is destroyed. The fighting is just absolute misery. I recommend, if any of you haven't seen it, the movie Enemy at the Gates, which depicts the Battle of Stalingrad and depicts the true life of a Russian sniper fighting during the battle, is a fantastic historical drama. It's a very good war film. It shows a pretty good overview of the battle itself. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. So check it out. To continue, Stalingrad becomes this quagmire that the Germans can't really escape. They keep feeding more troops in, more material, more tanks. Maybe this will be the breakthrough. And the Russians on the other side keep feeding more men into it, more tanks, more artillery. People are dying by the tens of thousands. Eventually, the Russians win the contest of wills, and surround the German units in the city. Essentially, the Germans go from besieging the Russians in the city to the flip side. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers are captured during this battle, absolutely breaking the myth of German invincibility, and also showing that from that point on, the Russians had the momentum. It's hard to pinpoint an exact moment that World War II historians would agree was the moment at which it was over for the Germans, but Stalingrad in a lot of ways becomes that avatar because once that battle was over, once Paulus and that 200 or 300,000 German soldiers surrendered, it was very difficult for the Germans to regain momentum after that. What's interesting about that is that not only is the largest group of men to surrender for the Germans in the entire war, the vast majority of them never made it back to Germany. As you expect, the Russians took out on them all of the worst things the Germans had been doing to the Russians for the previous year and a half. I think something in the neighborhood of only 20 or 30,000 of them ever see Germany again, many of them many years later. Trust me, they deserved it. Next, Midway in the Pacific. Like I said earlier, the United States was treading water early in the war in the Pacific, in which it really needed to do more than anything, needed to prevent the Japanese from expanding west. When you look at this, or excuse me, expanding east, when you look at this map, I want you to think about the ways in which the Japanese, now that they thought they had done their significant damage, though they would eventually find out that they didn't sink the carriers, the Japanese believed there was nothing between them and a complete takeover of American bases across the Pacific than those carriers. So as they hopped across islands that the Americans either owned or the Americans contested, particularly you can see here the Marianas, the Marshall Islands. You can see some of the ones we talked about like Guam that the Americans have painfully acquired over the decades. Everything comes down to a little speck of islands a few hours northwest of Hawaii, and this is the Midway Islands. This is probably the key battle of the Pacific Front early in the war, in which the Japanese attempted to trick the American carrier fleet into following them into an ambush at Midway. But as you guys remember, and as I mentioned, the Americans had already broken the Japanese code and were well aware of what the Japanese were up to when they attempted to trick them into this big battle. So the Americans went into the battle not only understanding what the Japanese were up to, but able to take advantage of it for themselves. And over the course of several harrowing hours and then finally more than a day or two, the Japanese and the Americans faced off in a titanic battle. And it was also one of the first big battles in which the Navy forces fighting each other never saw each other. The boats never came within enough miles to even see each other as anything more than a blip on the radar. Even then, sometimes not. A big part of the Battle of Midway is that the Americans, during the battle, flew to an open ocean area thinking the Japanese were there. At the same time, the Japanese flew to an open ocean area thinking the American carriers were there. The Americans eventually, thanks to one lucky pilot, one smart pilot maybe, found out where the Japanese carriers were and happened to attack and dive bomb them right in the middle of refueling and reammunitioning their first wave, which was a titanic blow to the Japanese. Several carriers were sunk, crippled, and the Americans won the Battle of Midway, essentially preventing further encroachment by the Japanese. After Midway, the Japanese would continue to attack, but it would be much closer to their homeland and would begin to play the defense. And once they started playing defense, it was only a matter of time for that great power that America had sitting in its back pocket, which we're going to talk about now. This is American industry and technology. We'll talk between this and we'll start here with the industrial side of World War II from the American home front. Then we'll kind of talk about the American home front in terms of the propaganda efforts, the social policy, stuff like that. So let's start here. The United States' biggest advantage in this war, and frankly its biggest advantage in most wars it faces, is its massive economic population and natural resources that it's able to muster at any given moment for a major output. In the 1940s, it's important to see that in a lot of ways, America hits the trifecta, to speak towards a nice racing analogy. America happens to be coming out of the Great Depression at an opportune time for American industry. It's also rebuilt the American workforce through things like the Work Progress Administration. We talked about the New Deal. More Americans are aware of their place in the U.S. economy. More Americans are able to access jobs. During the war itself, many unions step back and say they're willing to do whatever for the war effort. Essentially, there's this perfect storm of American economic power, American economic need, and then a war that kind of jump sparks the American economy from slowly recovering to hyperdrive superpower economy. Essentially, in the 4 years of the war that the United States participates in, the national budget jumps 11 times. It's 11 times bigger after the war is over than it was before the war, which should tell you something about the way in which this expands the American economy. It expands it on almost every level. Millions of Americans are put to work. Millions more of Americans, particularly women, as we'll talk about obviously, are put into work for the first time or in industries that weren't previously favorable for women in terms of allowing them to work. Obviously, as millions of men went to war, their jobs needed to be replaced, and millions of women didn't just go into the workforce, but found that the autonomy created by going into the workforce was important. And something they wanted to preserve after the war. Obviously, we'll talk about the ways in which that was essentially cheated from them, but let's talk about things first. Once the American draft was already underway, it was ramped up significantly, not just in terms of recruiting efforts, but also in terms of drafting efforts. Millions of American men are drafted. As I said, 16 million men will be in the military by the end of the war. It is a massive outpouring of America's population resources and economic resources. All of it is generally organized under the government office of the War Production Board, which works essentially, and this is kind of the way in which you see a capitalist society respond to war, as opposed to the Soviet model that's responding at the same time, is the rugged Soviet model of do whatever we say, this is the only way to win the war, works for them. The American side, though, is essentially an alliance between capitalist industrial power within the country and military production quotas. The military and the government set quotas, they set needs, and they set contracts. And the industry, understanding that it was going to make a shit ton of money, decided to get in on that. Not just because they weren't patriotic, but there is certainly, given what they made during the war, there was quite a bit of quite a bit of war profiteering from the major industrialists. At the same time, generally though, the War Production Board was very efficient. The American government by 45 is outproducing pretty much every other major nation, and several of them combined are well behind what the American government can produce monthly. Tanks, planes, guns, rifles, food, boats. I mean, the American government by the end of the war wasn't just producing it, they were overproducing it. The Americans win this war not necessarily with blood, with iron, but with resources, with organization, and with capital. The War Production Board gets the right things to the right, gets the right things where they're supposed to go, and then leave it up to the military, obviously, to decide where to allocate it. American manufacturing during the 40s truly is one of the most awe-inspiring movements in labor history, as they produce simply a staggering array of products for the war and for the home front. As you can see here, though, this is really, it happens on the back of millions of female workers who enter the workforce, first many of them looking for economic security, the jobs provided while men were away, but many others looking for an opportunity to leave the home, many for the first time. Without the war, just in the same way that without the men fighting in Europe, there's no way the American government is able to mobilize the resources they eventually mobilize without the help of women, certainly without the major help of women. The other side of this important moment isn't just in terms of what the government produces tangibly. The idea that for every tank, for every bomb, for every plane that goes out, obviously that's a good thing. But the U.S. government also benefits significantly from an extremely capable and prolific scientific community in the United States. Not all of them are U.S. Born, obviously. The most famous ones, Werner von Braun, Albert Einstein, are certainly not American-born, a high proportion of Germans, ironically. But what's important about this is the technological production that the U.S. experiences during this war is profound. Many of the inventions that you wouldn't necessarily think about in terms of their military things, today's microwaves, for example, microwave arrays, were discovered at first in pursuits of military equipment during World War II. Things like sonar, things like certain radio waves, the radio and code breaking. If any of you guys have ever seen, what was that movie about the guy who broke the code in Britain? Early computing. There is a huge outpouring of technological expertise for the Americans. Many college campuses across the country are given contracts by the exact same war production board or by other production boards in the U.S. government to essentially subsidize their war research. Students just like you guys, often if you didn't have a deferment for the war, if you were doing well enough scholastically, might either use that as a jump into the officer corps or sometimes right into management and production facilities. Really, almost all parts of American society, certainly all parts of society, middle-class society and up, mobilized quickly for the war. We should talk briefly at least about workers' rights at the time. Most unions signed contracts saying they wouldn't strike during a war. What they're also saying, though, is they forego any of their usual ways in which to affect change for the industrial powers at the time. As you guys know, workers' only real tool is striking. The vast majority of the big unions agree not to strike during the war. And in the end, while rewarded for it with salary and benefits during the war, certainly don't make the same amount of money as the industrialists themselves. I don't think I need to tell you that. The most important technological advance of the war, other than microwaves, given how much I enjoy microwaving things, is obviously going to be the invention of the atomic bomb. Another one of the technological advances achieved during the war, this is another one kind of showing off the way in which American science is able to take a step forward and help the war effort. Started as the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project started as kind of this very much an understanding of the ability to build a bomb or a weapon that will significantly change the war itself and obviously eventually change the society. The Germans were working on a very similar bomb, though in the end they don't come particularly close to atomic bombs. They do much better with guided rockets. They certainly do better with what we call heavy water production, which is essentially a quest for a hydrogen bomb of a different nature. But really, by the end of it, the Americans are the only ones who are even remotely close to atomic weaponry. And as we'll talk about later, by the time it is successfully detonated and tested in 1945, the Americans really just need a target to test it out fully. But they knew what they had, as he so often quoted, "I've become death, destroyer of worlds," is what Oppenheimer said upon seeing the mushroom cloud rise for the first time. When we talk about this after the war, it's really hard to conceptualize what nuclear technology did to world society, what it changed in terms of humanity knowing that at the brink of snap of the fingers, the entirety of it could be wiped out. It's truly a change in terms of how humans look at one another. We'll talk about it as it relates to the Cold War particularly. So that's our discussion of industry. We'll talk about the home front. Obviously, the U.S. Population had made the exact same sacrifices, having many of the exact same issues they saw in World War I, though obviously to a higher degree and in some cases significantly more problematic. Most Americans experienced several things during the period that should remind you a little bit about World War I. War bonds being a consistent source of funding. If you remember back from our discussion of war bonds the last time, war bonds are when you pay the government cash up front to help them cover the cost of the war, and they pay you back later, essentially a government loan in which you loan the government. War bonds remain an important part of America's ability to finance the war. Free speech doesn't mean careless talk. Another consistent thread among American propaganda was the concern of Americans and American citizens in particular spilling secrets to the theoretically thousands of spies from the Japanese, Germans, and Italians waiting at home. Obviously, we now know that's kind of silly. In fact, there were probably no more than 10 or 11,000 German or Italian families that were ever particularly impacted by the war. Obviously, we'll talk about the Japanese Americans in a second, but the idea that Americans were going around blabbing military secrets in their backyard was probably a little bit overblown. But the usual concern about Americans and sedition, or Americans and spies, traitors, the whole 9 yards, was far more blown up than you might actually expect, or well, you probably would expect. Rationing was particularly common during this war, for the simple fact that this gigantic American outpouring of industrial and economic power generally was going to sustain the war effort. Most Americans, even though they'll see significant jump in their quality of life after the war, many Americans feel the pinch of rationing. Certain things were impossible to get. Sugar could be difficult. You understand what I'm saying generally. Many foodstuffs were heavily restricted, and the ones that were available were generally, there were less things available. There was a constant societal encouragement not to use too much, not to take too much more, so that everybody would have some. I'm sure you guys recognize kind of the similarities between here and coronavirus, as you think about the fact that, when we tell people, do you really need to buy that 18th roll of toilet paper? There's others who need it. Rationing is particularly common across almost all economic or societal levelers, essentially. Big things like war cause rationing. So here's rationing. Let's talk about another one. We'll come back to the one on anti-Japanese propaganda in just a second. Let's talk about the one here. As you can see here, it says stamp out black markets with your ration stamps. As you might expect, rationing, or anytime any society succumbs to careful rationing or careful control over markets within its system, and we should mention that there were other American government industries that did things like fix the prices of certain foods so that inflation wouldn't impact them, fix the price of certain goods so that they'd be more widely available. Black markets spring up almost immediately in every society. I think probably the most interesting one was the siege of Paris in 1871, when by the end of it, if you were poor, you couldn't find a rat to eat, but if you were rich, you could still find roast pheasant. That's what a black market is, when goods are available essentially outside of legal means and only at the highest dollar. Americans were encouraged again and again, don't buy products that don't use your ration cards in an effort to avoid keeping essentially all of society happy and healthy. Black markets are a significant, but in the end, not overwhelming problem for the American economy. The other thing we need to talk about is the racial component of the war. And it's one that rears its head again and again in the Pacific. You see it quite out, if any of you have ever seen the TV show, The Pacific does an okay job with it. But there's some better book studies of the war that have examined the ways in which American and Japanese racial, social Darwinian beliefs about racial differences certainly made the war, especially in the Pacific, much, much more brutal. This comes a little bit from the same Japanese belief in their social Darwinian destiny, just like we talked about with white America and with eugenics and all that. The Japanese are also particularly proud of their racial prowess. The Japanese Empire we're talking about here, not individual Japanese American citizens. And as we'll talk about when we get to the Pacific War, it leads to a significant brutality between the two. At home, it largely shows up first as propaganda. You see here a stereotype of Japanese people as monkeys. There's a significant racial barrier between Americans, between white Americans and what they perceive, and we've talked about this again and again, as kind of the baseline of what it means to be an American citizen. During the war, this kind of reaches a fever pitch. in which Americans, so terrified of spies in their midst, so terrified of being attacked by a homegrown enemy that they don't know about, turn inwardly and attack their own fellow Americans. More than 100,000, something in the neighborhood of 115, 116,000 Americans are eventually, Japanese Americans, are then taken out of their homes and exiled to remote camps in the West, Manzanar and others. These are the famous internment camps of the United States in which American citizens, we're not talking about people who would come from Japan 5 minutes before the war, we're talking about tens of thousands of Japanese Americans who've been in the country for decades, who were absolutely American citizens, had their rights stripped from them, torn from their homes, their property, and their cities, and put in poorly conditioned, poorly set up, poorly managed camps for the duration of the war. There's no really getting around this one. A Japanese American citizen obviously sued the federal government. The course went to the Supreme Court during the war, and in the hideously deflating Korematsu v. U.S. Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court legalized essentially race quotas for determining how Americans could, or how the U.S. government could treat its American citizens, by saying that if the U.S. government has good reason to believe that this subsect or this race within the American people is somehow dishonest or is somehow, in their concern, disloyal, is the great thing the Supreme Court uses, that they can be interred. This breaks almost every known amendment. And Korematsu will eventually be overturned. More importantly, the U.S. government will apologize several times, though it will not finally finish or it will not apologize until 2006, and it won't finish its financial compensation until after that. What the American government did to Japanese American citizens, simply is hideous. There's no other word for it. At the same time in which Germans are putting Jews in camps because of their supposed inferiority, the fact that Americans were putting Japanese Americans in camps because of their racial disloyalty or their supposed racial disloyalty should stand out to us as a massive hypocrisy. We can be the good guys, we can win the war, we can do what we needed to do against the Nazis, but we can't ignore what we did to our people back home. So that's the home front. Let's talk about the rest of the war. The war in Europe. We'll start with Europe and then we'll finish with the Pacific, because that's exactly how the war itself goes. The war in Europe starts for the Americans in 1942. They believed that the best way to defeat Hitler wasn't to defeat him head-on in Europe, certainly not to invade France yet, certainly not to invade Germany yet, but to attack kind of the soft underbelly of the Axis forces in Europe, which was Italy. Under Mussolini, a series of defeats by the German/Italian armies in North Africa had led to the ability for the Americans, British, and Free French forces to invade Italy, thinking it would be a nice, quick, and easy campaign through the Italians, who were, up to this point, largely useless in the war. It was a good strategy, except for the fact that the Americans didn't really think much about the Italian terrain, and certainly didn't think too much about the ruthlessness of the Germans, who, as soon as they felt that their Italian ally was collapsing, simply invaded Italy and built a whole bunch of defensive structures all over Italy to prevent the Americans from advancing very far. This is the scene of some of the worst fighting for the Americans in the entire war, as they had to fight town after town, hill after hill, against well-entrenched and bloodthirsty German troops. Some of the best German troops of the war that fighting in Italy. It also means that Italy is knocked out of the war relatively quickly. Mussolini ends up having to be rescued by Hitler and brought back to Germany. But the Italians, for all their bluff and bluster in the 30s, don't do particularly well in this war, and it's only through the constant intervention of Hitler and German troops that the Italians had even made it to this point. So think about it this way: by 1942, 1943, Italy is not only knocked out of the war, but it's really just the Germans and their Eastern European allies versus the Soviets in the East, while in the West, the Germans are simply waiting for the other shoe to drop in terms of an invasion from the Americans and Brits across the Channel. And for the next couple of years, that's essentially what the Americans and Brits prepare for, a massive, massive undertaking that is Operation Overlord, better known to you guys as D-Day, the day they actually invade North America. I'm going to get it this time, northern France. What they're doing here is over those 2 years, about a year and a half, they're preparing a massive invasion. It's probably understated now how difficult it is to do a naval invasion. It's the reason that the Germans don't end up invading Germany. Germans don't end up invading Great Britain early in the war. It's difficult to accomplish. You need several things. You need air superiority, naval superiority. You need to be able to clear the beaches. You need to have a preponderance of forces. The Americans and the Brits don't think they have this preponderance. They don't have these things until well into 1944. By this point, the Soviets are freaking out. Stalin is asking again and again that the Americans and the British open up a second front to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front, but they wouldn't be hurried, and probably correctly they shouldn't have been hurried by Stalin, and they weren't. It's not until June of 1944 that they invade Europe and actually put American boots on the ground in France in a way that can attack Germany. For the next several months, they slug their way across France, and most Germans by this time are beginning to see the writing on the wall. As we'll talk about, as I should just say now, on the Eastern Front, under a couple of massive hammer blows, the Soviets have absolutely reeled back the German army. The climactic battle is the Battle of Kursk, in which more tanks are deployed on a single day between the German and Russian forces than at any other point in history. It's a massive battle. Millions are involved on both sides, and the Russians absolutely annihilate the German offensive ability. So just like after Stalingrad, it begins this long retreat backwards for the Germans. So essentially, they're being attacked in France by American and British armies, and they're being attacked all across their eastern border by massive Russian armies. By 1944, and certainly by early 1945, the question in Europe is not if, but when, and which side will get to the German capital at Berlin first, with all the bloodbath that would obviously entail. The Americans fight a series of very, very skillful defenses against the German counterattack at the Battle of the Bulge, but eventually, by 1945, both sides advance into Germany quickly. And by the end of it, it's the Russians, actually, who get to Berlin first. Knowing the casualties it would cause to take Berlin, Stalin very much wanted it for the Russians, though as a matter of prestige. This is the rising of the communist flag over the German parliamentary building in 1945, symbolizing the final collapse of Berlin. Hitler, being the coward that he was, shot himself and had his bodies burned in his underground bunker in Germany. If you guys have ever seen, in Berlin, if you guys have ever seen the movie Downfall, which chronicles the last few days and hours of Hitler's life, it's a German film, absolutely incredible. One of the best foreign films I've ever seen. I highly recommend it. So Hitler is dead. Victory in Europe has been achieved. So let's talk about, and we'll come back obviously to victory and what it means, but let's just talk about the military campaigns. Now let's jump to the military campaigns of the Pacific. So this is where we're going to stop today. We did Europe, we'll finish the Pacific, and then we jump back in on the next lecture. We'll be talking about peace in the beginning of the Cold War. So the Pacific. By 1942, 1943, America began to take more aggressive action against the Japanese, especially after the Battle of Midway. The process by which the Americans decide to do this is a little bit confused. There's so many islands across the southeast, so many ways in which the Pacific Islands could be attacked, that the Americans actually have a hard time deciding on a single strategy. They end up falling on several strategies kind of all at once, attacking strategic islands, bypassing some other islands, and essentially inching closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. The overall strategy is called island hopping, and this is a word to write down. The strategy by which the Americans strategically pick or do not pick certain islands to attack as they get closer to the Japanese home islands, the idea being that as each step they get closer, they get within a little bit closer range of those long American bombers that could annihilate the Japanese home islands, and therefore hopefully avoid having to invade. These battles cannot be described as anything other than absolutely brutal. The slog that it takes as American infantry and Marines take tiny island after tiny island from dug in and absolutely tenacious Japanese defenders really marks this one out as the conflict of brutality for the Americans. Not to say the European front wasn't ugly, but the Japanese front is truly one of those things that shows a lot about both sides as combat nations. What's interesting about this is, as the Japanese become more desperate, and as you remember me talking about, the lack of resources for the Japanese becomes a significant problem. By the end of the war, many of their trained pilots are dead. Much of their economic system is under shambles. As American planes get closer and closer, they're bombing the Japanese home islands almost daily. At one point, Tokyo itself is firebombed, resulting in nearly 1 million buildings burned in a single night, the single worst human disaster or human-caused fire disaster ever. And we're talking worse than the napalm the U.S. dropped on Vietnam. The bombing of Tokyo in '45 killed tens of thousands and left hundreds of other thousands burned and hideously scarred. And this is before we even dropped the atomic bomb. So it's probably something interesting to think about. In terms of the impact of the atom bomb, is American firebombing had done that several times over already, which was particularly bad in a Japanese society where almost all of its major housing was done in wood. On top of that, the Japanese turned to increasingly desperate measures to prevent the Americans from continuing to advance. This is the birth of the famous kamikaze pilots. Kamikaze is Japanese for divine wind and traces back to the 1300s, in which a Mongolian army that invaded across the sea from Mongolian-controlled China was swept away by a great monsoon. The Japanese were equally terrified of what final defeat would mean, especially for the more militant parts of the empire, and began to essentially throw lives at it. The kamikaze pilots would pilot planes without guns, without ammunition, just stocked with bombs, in the hopes of running themselves into American ships. They would attack carriers. They would attack battleships. They essentially killed themselves in an effort to prevent the Americans from inching closer and closer to their homeland. An incredible devotion that has been explored several times by military strategists. And most of them conclude that the Japanese elan, essentially the Japanese force was incredibly dedicated, not just to the country, but also to the military ethos that the military had produced over the past 30, 40 years. That instilled this rugged ability in terms of loyalty to the country, loyalty to the emperor. I know that everybody probably has heard the kamikaze pilots, but I think there's no better example of this than a Japanese soldier had been deployed to the Philippines as part of the force that took over the Philippines. And after the Americans invaded in 1945, his unit was defeated and he fled to the jungle. This man spent the next 30 years living in that jungle as a soldier of Japan. He didn't even know the war had ended. He and several of his companions spent nearly 30 years coming down from the mountains to steal food from the Philippines villagers who had no idea who they were. Eventually, they figured out this was the last guy there, found his name, tracked it back to where he served in Japan during the war itself, tracked down his retired captain living in Kyoto, and brought him from Kyoto in the 1970s to the Philippines, where there was this emotional meeting as this Japanese soldier who had been fighting World War II for 30 more years, in his mind, met his captain, who finally told him that the emperor told him the war was over and he could come home. 30 years. I don't know anything Americans would do for 30 years. Certainly wouldn't be served in the Philippine jungles. An incredible testament to the Japanese military. The craziest part about that is he wasn't the only one. There were several of them that were found decades later.
By the end of the war, though, Americans have put together the problem of invading the home islands when Japan is fighting like this for every little atoll across the Pacific. And the decision comes that the atomic bomb should probably be dropped. By this point, FDR has passed away, and Truman, who we'll talk about later, is president. Truman makes the actual decision to drop the bombs, and these bombs, first at Hiroshima and second at Nagasaki, kill hundreds of thousands, but more clearly demonstrate the difference between old bombing power, which, as devastating as it was nothing like the world had seen. And the birth of the atomic age leads directly to the surrender of the Japanese. The surrender of the Japanese, you can see here aboard the Nimitz, is kind of a national psyche collapses here. The first time many Japanese hear even the voice of their emperor for the first time over radio, which for many of them would have been the first time they heard him ever, was when he announced to the people of Japan that they had to surrender and lay down their arms. The end of the war in Japan comes obviously after the end of the war in Europe, meaning the end of the war overall. So that's the end of World War II. We will talk, next time I'll lecture about the Holocaust. We'll come back and talk about that, and then we'll talk about what the end of World War II means overall. We'll talk about the birth of the Cold War. We'll talk about the 1950s and Korea. We'll get into all of that. This is the end of the military campaigns of World War II. I'll see you next time.
Yep.